When I first learned of the terrorist attack in France, I had a lot of emotions flood through me relatively quickly. And the first one was simply shock. I was in shock. I saw the pictures, I saw videos, I heard the voices of those who were there, and my brain just simply couldn't wrap itself around it. I was in shock, but then that shock rapidly turned into anger. Anger at those who would perpetrate such a heinous act. Anger at those who have no regard for the preciousness of every human life, for the sanctity of human life. And when I'm angry like that, I find myself starting to think, you know what? Let's just take a couple of bombs and drop them down there and end this whole thing. Well, so much for the sanctity of human life and the preciousness of every human life, right? So that wouldn't work. Anyway, anger cycles into fear. And when I'm afraid, I want to turn my house into a fortress. And I want to get my children and their spouses and my wife and I all together and say, okay, it's us against the world. Try and get us. But you know, that doesn't work. If something horrible like that should happen, we need each other. We need each other. Nobody can go it alone. It just won't work. Fear then went into deep sadness. Sadness for these people who all they wanted was a fun evening. All they wanted to do was go out and have a good time. And instead, they lost their lives, or they lost the life of a loved one. And it brought on deep sadness. And that sadness then went back into anger, and the whole thing started to cycle again. You know, this is where Christians like to toss out those little pious platitudes. You know, well, it must have been a part of God's plan, or, well, God must have had a reason. Well, you know what? Both of those statements are a pile of garbage. Both of them. Because neither one of them are true. Because both of those statements are based on a false premise. And the premise is this: everything that happens is God's will. That's the premise that those two statements are based on. Because if you believe in any way, shape, or form that those terrorist attacks were in any way God's will, then you have to believe that everything that happens is God's will. Where the truth is simply that not everything that happens is God's will. Sometimes meaningless things happen. Not everything that happens is God's will. Because if that were true, then that would mean that sin was God's will. I mean, really, right? If everything that happens is God's will, then that means sin is God's will. And what kind of a twisted God would punish people for doing his will? Do you understand? Is this making sense? Not everything that happens is God's will. And certainly, what happened in Paris was not God's will. Don't toss out that garbage. Oh, God had a plan. No, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. Because it's false. That was not God's will. So why do things like that happen? What's the truth behind all of this? Well, the truth behind all of it is this: God gave us freedom. God doesn't manipulate us like marionettes on a string. God gave us freedom. God gave us the freedom to do good and the freedom to do evil. God gave us that freedom. Why? Why would he do that? because he wants love to be genuine. He wants us to love one another with a genuine love, and he wants us to love him with a genuine love. You see, genuine love can only exist where there's the possibility of it being withheld. Let me repeat that. Genuine love can only exist where there exists the possibility of it being withheld. It's only genuine if you could say no. For example, if I take a gun and hold it at somebody's head and say you love me, and so that person says, I love you, it's not real love, is it? It's forced. Because that person couldn't say no. Or what if I drug that person or hypnotize that person and say you love me, and they say that they love me? It's not genuine because it's forced, because the person had no opportunity to say no. Genuine love requires free will. Genuine love requires the freedom to say yes or the freedom to say no. Unfortunately, with that free will comes the freedom to do good or the freedom to do evil. And unfortunately, those in Paris exercised their freedom to do evil. And then, of course, you'll get somebody to say, well, God is in control. Yeah, well, I'll agree. God is in control. God is steering the ship in a direction. He's at the helm. He's steering the ship. But we are free to move about the ship any way we want. So while God is in control in that he's steering the ship in a direction toward completeness, we are free to move around and free to do good or free to do evil. So what happened in Paris was a meaningless act of terror. But don't think that God wasn't there, because God was there. God was there. God had his hands, had his arms around each and every person as they fell to the ground. God had his arms around each and every person who was holding on to a loved one who was wounded. God was outside that stadium. God was in that restaurant, and God was in that concert hall. God was there. And that is truth. That is truth. Now, I want to say something else. The terrorist act in Paris is not God's judgment on any particular sin. That's another ludicrous thing that Christians tend to say, or a few Christians tend to say. Well, God must have been judging them for some sin. God doesn't work that way. God took sin and nailed it to the cross and dealt with it that way. Period. Period. He doesn't zing down lightning bolts or utilize machine guns to cast judgment on sin. Sin has been taken care of through Jesus Christ. You know, if this was God's punishment for some sin, then let's use our heads for a minute. Why aren't the drug warlords getting zapped? Why aren't the child molesters getting zapped? Why aren't the drunk drivers getting zapped? Why aren't the abusers and the molesters getting zapped? That argument does not hold water. This was not God's judgment on some kind of sin. And it would be very, very easy for us to shake our fist at God and say, you don't get it. You don't understand what it's like to live in this world. You don't know what it's like to live in a world of terror and fear. But the truth is, God does know what it's like to live in a world of terror and fear. Because that was the world he entered as Jesus Christ. He entered a world that was under foreign occupation. The Romans. And Roman soldiers could come to your house at any time and demand payment for taxes. And if you didn't have the money, they could take your son, they could take your daughter, they could take your land, they could take anything you wanted. And you never knew when that might happen. And as far as terrorists are concerned, there's a group of Jews called the Zealots. And the extremist end of the Zealots believed that if you paid taxes to Rome, you were a traitor. And you see, the Zealots believed that God was angry at them for not taking up arms and violently overthrowing the Roman government and pushing them out of the land God had given to them. So they took up arms. And they would go into crowds and take their daggers. And they'd get 1, 2 people, maybe 3, and then slip away in the chaos. They knew fear. They knew terrorists. Jesus lived in that world. So Jesus understands what living in a world of fear is all about. God understands what living in a world of fear is all about. But there's another thing. There's one more reason why I get angry at God. Because how many times have I stood in that sanctuary and prayed for God to do something to bring about peace, to enter the hearts of the leaders of people, to change hatred into love, violence into peace. How many times have I prayed in that sanctuary for God to do something? I'll bet it's at least twice a month, and if you multiply that by the multiple services per day, you get 300 to 400 times. 300 to 400 times I've prayed for God to do something to bring about peace. I think that equals persistence. I think that counts as persistence in prayer. But there's one thing I have to remember. And that's, I'm not God's boss. I'm not God's boss. God is under no obligation to do whatever I tell him to do or even ask him to do. God is not like the vending machine where I put my coin in and I pull on the knob and the goods come out. That's not how it works. I'm not God's boss. And I have to keep that in mind if I find myself getting angry at God. So what does this leave us with? Well, what are we left with here? Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, when he says pray for those who persecute you, he's not saying pray that they may see the light or pray that they may come around to your way of thinking or our way of thinking. He means pray for them. Pray for them to have good families. Pray for them to have joy. Pray for laughter. Pray for peace. Pray for them to have fulfillment in life. That's praying for your enemy. So, translating that into today, it means praying for ISIS. Now, I have to admit, right now I can't. Praying for ISIS would be a good thing, but right now, I can't do it. And I'm hoping that maybe some of you can make up for my deficiency in that area and pray as Jesus told us to pray. Because right now I can't. I just can't. Hopefully one day I will, but today is not that day. What are we left with? Well, first of all, we're left with faith. We're left with the faith that God was standing beside every victim of that terrorist act. We're left with the faith that God is standing by and strengthening those who lost loved ones. We're left with the faith that God is standing by our side to get us through when we're angry or fearful or sad. We have the faith that God was there and God is here. That's the first thing we have. We have faith. The second thing we have is hope. We have hope because we know that this life is not all that there is. This very, very short period of life is not all there is. And even if we live to be 110 years old, that's still a pretty short time when compared to eternity. God has a place prepared. God has a place prepared in His eternal kingdom. A place that's eternal. Eternal. That's our hope. And number 3, we have love. Love because we're all in this together. We're all in this together. We ride the stormy seas of life in the same boat. We're all in this together, and we need each other. So it leaves us with love. Faith, hope, and love. No corny cliches, no pious platitudes. Faith, hope, and love. The truths that we need to help us live in a world of fear. God is by our side, just as He was by the side of every victim of that attack. God has a place prepared for us, just as He has a place prepared for those victims. And no matter what happens, we go through it together. We go through it together. Faith, hope, and love. That's how we live in a world of fear. Amen.